Okay, so two pirates, Morty and Jack, they meet in a bar. Jack, he has a patch over his eye, he has a hook for a hand, and he has a wooden peg leg. "Ahoy, matey," says Morty. "What happened to ya?" That's the last of my pirate accent, okay? So Jack responds, "My ship was attacked and a cannonball lopped off my leg. So now I got a wooden peg." "And your hand?" asks Morty. "When my ship sank, a shark bit off my hand, so now I have me a hook." "Okay, but what's with the eye patch?" "I got a piece of dirt in my eye, and now I'm blind in that eye." "But a person don't go blind from a piece of dirt." "True," says Jack, "but it was my first day with the hook." You were supposed to laugh. I said, at least the deacon will laugh, you know? You know, while we may not have much in common with Jack the Pirate when it comes to our physical sight, his self-inflicted wound, I think, resonates with us when it comes to our spiritual sight, spiritual vision, or spiritual blindness. So the readings for this Sunday, they seem to be on the surface about just this simple miracle, right? Ordinary miracle in the life of Jesus, healing this blind man. So it's a physical healing on the surface. But we know that when we read the Bible, we need to go deeper, that there's deeper message at stake, one that's very personal, one that's very intimate. And I think the message today is that our readings, they're pointing to our need to go deeper, and for our need for God in order to really see. As I'm hearing the gospel proclaimed, it seems so clear, the story of Bartimaeus, why it's so important for us is that his story is our story. So why is it important for us to correct our spiritual vision? Well, because in our busy lives, we may be blind. We may become blind to the people and the things that bring us real joy and real meaning. Why do we need to correct our spiritual vision? Well, with so many demands placed on us, we may find it hard to see the possibilities of doing good in our lives. Well, maybe because we tend to recast situations to justify our self-absorption. The way we tweak our vision in the world is really about self-serving and a refusal to accept responsibility for our actions or inactions. Maybe that's what we need to correct. Well, the blind Bartimaeus' cry is really a prayer, and it's our prayer. "Master, I want to see." In our hearts, I really believe that each of us, we want to see. And we want to see the world the way that God sees the world. That's why we ask why. Why, God? Why? We want to see the way He sees. I really believe that what we want to see is greater meaning and purpose in our world and in our lives. We have a desire for that. We also have a capacity for it. In our gospel passage, it really provides for us a spiritual roadmap. It gives us the direction, the steps we need to take in order to go on the way. I love that. So this poor blind man is on the side of the road, and he hears about Jesus. He has nothing else to lose, and he yells out, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me. Have pity on me. I want to see." And then he's healed. And then what happens? Jesus calls him, and then he's on the way. So in our gospel passage, as I mentioned, we find a spiritual roadmap. So as we dive into this gospel, I'd like to identify two insights or two features in this story that I believe can help us attain greater clarity of vision when it comes to our relationship with God in our spiritual life. And the first really important detail is this. Look at Jericho as a symbol, not just as a historical location, which it is, but look at it as a symbol, and particularly a symbol for our modern culture and the obstacles we experience in our lives. Right immediately at the beginning of the passage, we hear that Jesus, he's leaving Jericho on his way to Jerusalem. Right? So he's leaving this place on the way to a really important place, Jerusalem, where he offers his life for the salvation of the world. So what he's leaving behind is really less than where he's going in terms of importance and priorities. It's biblical code. So it's worth noting that Jericho is a city that still exists today. They say it's approximately 11,000 years old. So Jericho is an important city also because that's the place where the Israelites went into the promised land. So it's in Jericho where they really enter into the promised land, where they leave behind Egypt and go into the land flowing with milk and honey. It's important to acknowledge and remember that. That's where God's promise is. So we may say that Jericho, it stands as an obstacle, right? The Israelites had to bring the walls of Jericho down in order to go into the promised land. So Jericho kind of stands for like a spiritual block, or maybe a difficulty we're experiencing on our journey towards the promised land. Today's culture is like a Jericho, as I mentioned. And it's like a Jericho in many ways because it instills a kind of blindness in us. It keeps us from seeing things the way that we want to see and that God wants us to see. The way that God intended things to be seen. Friends, we live in a culture that says everyone has a price. Everyone has a price. That some people are more valuable than others. We live in a culture that celebrates autonomy of the individual and the degradation of the common good. My needs are more important than others. That's the mentality that we're inundated with every single day. My needs over the world's, over my neighbor, over my spouse, over my children. You see, the secular eye, it sees the world, but it has a hard time seeing the spiritual and transcendent dimensions that we know exist. So the blind Bartimaeus, he's sitting there on the roadside at Jericho, and he represents us. And he's a symbol for all of us as well. All of us who are often blinded and we're so distracted by the culture in our life and temptation to sin. So first, as I mentioned, the first feature, the first insight is Jericho and what Jericho represents, and then what Bartimaeus represents. The second insight is this. Look at how Bartimaeus responds. What he says is so important. So what does Bartimaeus do? What he says and does is important. What does he do first? So on hearing the gospel, right, this is what we heard. On hearing that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began crying out and to say, Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me. That is an essential first step in our relationship with God. Often what blocks us in our relationship with God is really a lack of humility. We hear how Jesus responds to Bartimaeus, and he shouts out, again, Bartimaeus, have pity on me, he says to Jesus. Have pity on me. And these, again, are tough words to say, especially because we're so programmed to idolize self-affirmation and self-assertion. I don't need anyone's help. I could figure this out all on my own. Well, if I don't need my neighbor, then why do I need my God? You see, Bartimaeus, he knows that he is blind. He's not trying to play games or play pretend. He's not trying to fool anyone. He knows that he doesn't have the power to solve his own problem. Bartimaeus knew precisely what he wanted, his sight. And he also knew that the Son of God was the only one who had the power to help him. Friends, I think that in our spiritual lives, we don't always have a good grasp of what we need. We're pretty good at knowing what we want, and we're pretty good at letting other people know. But when it comes to what we need, that's a different story. And what can make this difficult for us is that it involves one thing in particular, as I briefly mentioned, that few people are willing to face. And it's self-examination, internal honesty and reflection, the ability to acknowledge that I'm broken, and I'm a mess, and I'm a sinner, and I don't have what it takes to fix my own problems. I don't have what it takes to carry the weight of the world. I don't have what it takes to love my spouse or to be faithful to my work. Friends, this is such an important movement in our spiritual lives. That's how it begins with Bartimaeus, because he's an image or a symbol for us. But it begins with, Lord, have pity on me. I need you. Because it's when we realize our helplessness in the face of our sin, when we realize that we do need help and that we can't do it on our own, well, that's when we begin to make room for God's power to work within us. Why is it that when people are at the lowest point of their lives is that when God works incredible things in their lives? Because that's when they come face to face with their need. But it doesn't have to get to that point. It doesn't have to get there. So Jesus asks Bartimaeus point blank, which I love. Jesus often does this in the Gospels, right? He says, all right, so what do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? Bartimaeus turns to the Lord and he knows exactly what he wants. And you can almost sense the emotion in the words. Master, I want to see. I want to see. Bartimaeus simply wants to see. Again, don't just see this physically. He wants to see, but he represents us who need to see spiritually. For him, there's no grasping at power. He doesn't say, I want power, I want revenge, I want glory, I want authority, I want privilege. Not only does he know what he wants, he knows what he needs to be made whole. Here we might ask ourselves, how would we respond to Jesus' question? I mean, if he were here face to face to you and he asked you that question, what do you want? How would you answer? Friends, my prayer for you this week is that you ask and you receive the ability to see God's presence in your life with greater clarity. I hope that you see the possibilities for love and for hope in your life to a larger extent. And my prayer for you is to see your ability to be the means of God's compassion and love in the world in such a unique way. Master, I want to see. Do you?